what in the world was going on? It's probably what David was thinking. His own son, Absalom, was at the city gate, winning the hearts of the people, and he was pledging justice. Year after year, David trusted his son, probably thought that they were reconciled through a lot of family drama, but I think he misjudged the situation. Absalom had charm. He cleverly positioned himself as the defender of the people, manipulating their grievances to win their trust. He went to Hebron to make a vow. And now every trumpet that had called, every whisper said, "Absalom reigns," was a dagger in disguise as devotion. David's servants, his trusted official, his counselors, started to join Absalom. There was betrayal from within. David's men didn't stand with him anymore. A messenger told him all of Israel's hearts were with Absalom. If they stayed in Jerusalem, they would bleed, and the blood would stain his hands. To stay would be to risk civil war. Swords would fly in the city, and he didn't want to be the cause of their ruin. It would be bitter if David had to flee. He'd have to leave the palace. He'd have to leave the ark. He'd have to leave family behind. Would his people, would the city, would his family ever forgive him if he left? If David left, he would feel like he abandoned, and his son would claim the throne. David's heart broke. He made the decision to leave the city because he felt like it was his duty. He wanted the city to persevere and his people to persevere. He believed in a gracious God and that God would deliver him from his misery. So he left the city in tears. And this is where we pick up in 2 Samuel chapter 15, verse 30. This is what it said David did. But David continued up the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went. His head was covered and he was barefoot. All the people with him covered their heads too and were weeping as they went up. David had to flee the city so quickly he didn't even grab shoes. They were running away because they didn't want to be ruined by David's son Absalom. So they left quickly. And it was in this moment, I think David wrote Psalms 55. It's the moment where he was fleeing from his life. Everybody that he had trusted in, his friends, his son, his counselors, had all betrayed him. They had started a rumor about the injustice, and they were going to attack David. So he heard word early enough that he took his close loved ones, and they fled. And this is where we pick up in Psalms 55, starting off in verse 1. Listen to my prayer, O God. Do not ignore my plea. Hear me and answer me. My thoughts trouble me, and I am distraught. Because of what my enemy is saying, because of the threats of the wicked, for they bring down suffering on me and assail me in their anger. My heart is in anguish within me. The terrors of death have fallen on me. David feels betrayed. And I think this is something we can all resonate with at some part in our life. Whether it's been a friend, an employer, or a spouse. Maybe you had told a friend something in confidence and you heard that it got out. Somebody you thought you could trust, somebody thought you could rely on. Maybe it was an employer who had made a promise about a promotion and you find out that you haven't been, but some other people have. It's a feeling of betrayal. They had said something that didn't come true. Or maybe it was a spouse that had made a promise not to go back to something that had almost ruined your marriage. Go back to that temptation, and then you find out that it happened again. It's that feeling of betrayal. I think we have all experienced that in some way. So then what is betrayal? What is betrayal? Betrayal is simply this. Betrayal is being wounded or disappointed, let down by someone you love or trust. Betrayal is being wounded, disappointed, or let down by somebody you love or trust. And sometimes the ones that you love the most are the wounds that hurt the most. We've all experienced it, and David writes Psalm 55 to help us experience that disappointment. It leaves a wound that we don't like to address. And David felt the epitome of what this does in our own life. So therefore, he wrote Psalms 55 to help us address the feeling of betrayal. So I'm going to read all of Psalms 55, and then we can break it down a little bit more. So hear these words. Psalms 55. Listen to my prayer, O God. Do not ignore my plea. Hear me and answer me. My thoughts trouble me, and I am distraught because of what my enemy is saying, because of the threats of the wicked, for they're bringing down suffering on me and assail me in their anger. My heart is in anguish within me. The terrors of death have fallen on me. Fear and trembling have beset me. Horror has overwhelmed me. I said, oh, that I had wings of a dove. I would fly away and be at rest. I would flee far away and stay in the desert. I would hurry to my place of shelter, far from the tempest and the storm. Lord, confuse the wicked, confound their words, for I see violence and strife in the city. Day and night they prowl about on its walls. Malice and abuse are within it. Destructive forces are at work in the city. Threats and lies never leave its streets. If an enemy were insulting me, I would endure it. If a foe were rising against me, I would hide. But it is you, a man like myself, my companion, my close friend, with whom I once enjoyed sweet fellowship at the house of God, as we walked about among worshipers. Let death take my enemies by surprise. Let them go down alive to the realm of the dead, for evil finds lodging among them. As for me, I call to God, and the Lord saves me. Evening, morn, and noon, I cry out in distress, and he hears my voice. He rescues me unharmed from the battle waged against me, even though many oppose me. God, who is enthroned from old, who does not change, will hear them and humble them, because they have no fear of God. My companion attacks his friends. He violates his covenant. His talk is smooth as butter, yet war is in his heart. His words are more soothing than oil, yet they are drawn swords. Cast your cares on the Lord, and he will sustain you. He will never let the righteous be shaken, but you, God, will bring down the wicked into the pit of decay. The bloodthirsty and the deceitful will not live out half their days. But as for me, I trust in you. Please join me in prayer. God, thank you for today. As we read your word, my hope is you open our hearts and our minds for what you have. You allow us to push into the hard places, and we allow the truth of your word to speak and to comfort and to assure us as we dive in. Amen. Man, Psalms 55 is heavy. It brings us into a place to deal with a lot of emotions, but what I love is how David writes it. He breaks it down. Essentially, there's 3 different prayers that he breaks Psalms 55 down to, and there's similar themes in each prayer. So what I want to do is take the first part of this today and break down what are some of those themes that we can see in Psalm 55. So what are the unique themes found in Psalms 55? And I think this theme comes up again. So one of the themes I think is very present is that he brings his feeling of brokenness and betrayal to God. David does this multiple ways and multiple times in Psalms 55. He brings his feeling of brokenness and betrayal to God. Look how each of these prayers opens up, right? The first section simply says this, verse 1, listen to my prayer, O God. Do not ignore my plea. Hear me and answer me. Verse 16, as for me, I call to God, and the Lord saves me. Evening, morning, and noon, I cry out in distress. We know that David is going through some pretty hard things. He feels betrayed by those that he loved, people that he once trusted. And as he's fleeing the city that he was ruling over, the first thing that he does is, as we read through 2 Samuel, you know that he's feeling a heavy burden. On that march up to Mount Olive, he calls out to God. He cries out. He says, Lord, hear my prayer. I think often when I feel overwhelmed, when I feel distressed, when I feel crushed, what is my first natural reaction? It's either to ignore it, to suppress it, or act like it doesn't happen, or to overcompensate and do it on my own. The thing David does, he says, I call to God. So allow that to be our first response. When we begin to recognize the heavy things that are going on, we allow that to be our natural reaction, to cry, to call out to God. Because I think what David does is he shows us why. Continuing in verse 17, he says, I cry out in distress, and he hears my voice. He rescues me unharmed from the battle waged against me, even though many oppose me. He cries out because he knows the Lord is going to hear us. So I don't know where you guys are at this morning. I don't know who needs to hear this, but whenever you call out, he hears us. That is a truth and a comfort that we should all be able to hold to no matter what circumstances you find yourself in. Because then David leads us into the next step of his prayer. Not only does he call out, but he leads with vulnerability. He calls us to a place to put words to those feelings we might not know how to put words to. He feels some pretty heavy things, and he uses this kind of language. So follow me. Let's go to verse 2. Hear me and answer me. My thoughts trouble me, and I am distraught. Verse 4, my heart is in anguish within me. The terrors of death have fallen on me. Fear and trembling have beset me. Horror has overwhelmed me. Verse 17, evening, morning, and noon, I cry out in distress. David is distraught. He's in anguish. He feels overwhelmed, and he's in distress. David is feeling some pretty big emotions as he's writing Psalms 55, as he felt like everybody that he trusted in has betrayed him, doesn't have his back anymore. He's putting heavy words to the emotions that he's feeling. He's leading with vulnerability on purpose. Because I think it's sometimes important to be able to recognize what we're feeling so then we can begin to deal with it. This last week, my wife and I had signed my son up for an athletic camp. When we signed him up, I said, hey, do you want to do this? And he said, I don't know if I want to. So me and my ultimate wisdom said, let's sign him up and I'll talk him into it before we go. The morning of, I go, hey, you ready for camp? And he goes, Dad, I don't want to go. And I was crushed. I was like, but we signed you up. And my wife, in her wisdom, was like, let's use this as a teaching moment. I was like, okay, I'm in. Let's see what we can do. And so as we began to break this down, I said, hey, why don't you want to go? Just tell us why, and we're not going to force you to do something you don't want to do. But we need to at least have a conversation about it. Because he said, Dad, I just don't want to. I just don't want to. But I knew there was a reason why. We had signed him up for a volleyball camp. And I love volleyball. I love to play. I love to watch. I love to coach. I love to ref. Like, that's one of my passions. And I was like, if he can start early, he's going to be amazing. But he was like, I don't want to. And so we began to break it down. I said, why don't you want to go? And it took us about 20 minutes to help him put words to what he was feeling so that we can begin to address what the problem actually was. And when it came down to it, he was worried that he was going to get made fun of because volleyball is known as kind of a girl sport. And I said, I can start there. And so I pulled up my Instagram reel and I showed him all the men professional volleyball players that I follow. And I said, these guys are studs, right? Like they jump through the ceiling, like they can pound a ball to the floor. Like, that's something to aspire to. It's like we got to start breaking those stereotypes because it's not just a feminine sport. So we started from there, and he eventually was able to go to camp, and he loved it, and he went back the second day, and I was super pumped. But it was one of those moments where we need to learn to put words to those emotions that we feel, because then we have room to work on those things. And I think that's what David is doing. He's giving us these words to use as he's going through really hard seasons, really hard moments. So David is leading the way with vulnerability. And then that shows us the last consistent theme that we see as a part of this, as David is showing us how to cry out and how to bring his feelings of brokenness and betrayal to God. Because then what David does is he literally tells God, this is what I'm feeling. I need you to do something about it. I need you to make a move. Because me, in my own power, I can't do this. He recognizes as he's leaving Jerusalem, going up to Mount Olives, not the Mount of Olives, that he didn't have the power to change what had happened. So he said, God, I need you to come in here and to make the next move. And he does it 3 times. In verse 9, he says it this way. He says, Lord, confuse the wicked, confound their words, for I see violence and strife in the city. He's saying, God, there's people behind me that are trying to tear down my name. They're spreading lies, they're spreading rumors. And he says, allow those words to hold no weight. I can't do that on my own, but I know you can do that. says, confuse their words. Allow them those words not to have any weight against me. But what I think is interesting is David's praying a pretty bold prayer. Because what he's doing is he's reminding God of something that he's already done. It's a pretty bold ask. Because early on in Genesis, the entire world spoke one language, and they were using bricks to build this temple to essentially be closer to God, to be their own God. And God saw them. And so he gave them different languages, and he dispersed them. At the Tower of Babel, David was reminding God of what he had done, and he said, can you do the same thing for me? It's a pretty bold ask. He said, I would love it if you would make their language hold no weight, so allow their words to hold no weight and disperse them so my enemies no longer pursue me. He's only asking God to do something that he's already done. And then continue in verse 15. He says, let death take my enemies by surprise. Let them go down alive to the realm of the dead, for evil finds lodging among them. He's literally asking God to open up the earth and to swallow his enemies alive. It's a pretty bold ask. But same thing, he's reminding God of something that he's already done. Because as Moses led the Israelites through the wilderness, there was a rebellious group that came up to Moses and said, we don't like what you're doing. We'll do our own thing. And Moses prayed to God, and God opened up the earth and swallowed that rebellion whole. David was reminding God of something that he already done. He said, I need your help to make a way through this. It's a pretty bold ask. And then he finishes in verse 23. He says, but you, God, will bring down the wicked into the pit of decay. The bloodthirsty and deceitful will not live out half their days. This is what David wanted. David wanted justice. He knew that he couldn't do it on his own, and he wanted God to do it for him. So what I want to do here is I want to break down Psalms 55, and I want to package it in a way that's easy for us to receive. So I want to say, let's push through those hard emotions. Let's call those things out. Let's let God come in and begin to help us find forgiveness if it's available, and begin working on restoration. But the thing that frustrates me is this Psalms is not about forgiveness. Like Brennan said last week, sometimes the Psalms are hard because they force us to feel things we don't necessarily want to feel. Psalms 55 is a psalm about betrayal. And David calls us into feeling the hard emotions of what betrayal actually does, what betrayal actually feels like. So then what does David do? How can we respond to betrayal in our own lives? And I think there's three things. There's three things that we can kind of take away from Psalms 55. The first one is simply this, is we need to remember God's character. We need to remember his character. And David does this multiple times through Psalms 55. He calls us in a place to remember how he got to where he was. In verse 19, he says it this way, God who is enthroned from old, who does not change. There's two pieces of God's character that we need to be aware of. That God is enthroned, that God is on the throne. That God is our Savior. He is on the throne of our own life. That David is trusting God to be the king of his own life. As he is leaving Jerusalem where he was king, he can no longer reign over his people. His son was trying to come in and take the throne. And he said, but Lord, I trust you. You are the king of my life. You are on the throne. And I know that you will help me no matter what circumstances I'm in. So he's calling God to be the king of his own life. Not to take justice into his own hands, but to allow God to be the ruler and the one who brings justice. So can we do that when we experience these hard things? Can we allow God to be God? And for us not to seek justice, but allow God to do that in the end. And I think he can do that because of the second part of the verse. He says, you're a God from old, a God who does not change. He's saying, God, you are the God of yesterday, today, and forever. Hebrews 13:8 says it this way, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And what I love about this verse is in June, I got to spend 2 weeks at camp with our mid-high and our senior high students. And this was one of our memory verses. So every morning what I would do with our students is we'd get together and I'd say, okay, let's memorize these verses, because if they could recite them, they would get points for their team. And then if they got enough points by the end of the week, they would win a prize. And me, I'm super competitive. So I was like, we're going to do this as a group exercise. You're going to memorize this verse. But what I loved is as we did this every day, as we memorized these verses, by the end of the week, I was like, okay, so it's ingrained in our heart, but what does that actually mean? What does Hebrews 13:8 actually mean? Not just memorizing this. And I think how they responded should give us something to think about. One of my mid-high students said, no matter what I've done, God will always be there. They recognized that in their season of life, sometimes I'm not the most consistent person, but God is. So no matter what I've done, I know that I can always come back to him, and he's always going to be there. And then one of my senior high students said, no matter what circumstance I might find myself in, God will be the same. As my life is consistently changing from year to year. This was a graduating senior who was making a decision on what school to go to next, what career to follow, what job path to go on. Some big life decisions, but those decisions seem like they're the only way in. And everything in their world is about to change in the next year. And they were able to find comfort in this verse by saying, no matter what circumstances I find myself in, God is going to be the same God no matter what. And I think for me, in this room, we should find comfort in that. Being reminded that no matter what circumstances we find ourselves in, no matter how chaotic, no matter how much turmoil we might feel, that God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And I think as David is able to say this leads me into my second point, that we need to remember his ways. Remember God's ways, because his ways are much more different than my ways. David makes some pretty bold asks when he's praying. He's saying, I need you to take care of this because I can't. But the unique part about this story is we actually know what happens to Absalom. We know that David's men go into battle and pursue Absalom, and he dies. And it doesn't happen the way in which David planned. God's ways are different than our ways. And I think there's one question that we haven't quite asked yet, is why did Absalom betray David? I think that's a key question to ask in the midst of this story. Because Absalom was one of 17 sons from a few different mothers of David. And his stepbrother had taken advantage of his sister. So much so that his sister couldn't show her face in public anymore. She was so shamed by what had happened that she hid. And Absalom was furious. He was so mad. He waited 2 years after David had found out for him to do something about it. And David never did anything. So Absalom took justice into his own hand and he killed his stepbrother. After he killed him, he fled because he didn't want to reap the punishment that it was due to him. After he fled, David found out and felt like he had lost 2 sons. So after mourning and being sad for many years, David's trusted advisor went to Absalom and he asked him to come back into the city. So Absalom did. And then for 2 years, David wouldn't look at his face. Absalom felt abandoned. He felt like justice hadn't been served. So then what he did is he cleverly positioned himself outside of the city gates. He had gained 50 men who would follow him and who saw the injustice that he had experienced. So then as people came into the town, he would say, hey, can I help you with anything? Do you have any situations you're having troubles with? Can I help you solve any injustice? And by doing so, he started winning the hearts of the people. So much so that people wanted Absalom to reign. And I don't think this came as a surprise to David. Because a few chapters before that is when David took advantage of Bathsheba. And his trusted counselor Nathaniel came and he said, calamity will come on your family because of the decisions you made. So I don't think Absalom or David made the best decisions in this circumstance. But what I do know is that David was a man after God's own heart. Always didn't make the right decisions, but at the end of the day, he came back. He found restoration and redemption with God. He continued to learn and to pray to know who he was. And so our ways aren't always God's way. And it's remembering the full story of what brought us here today. And I think for me, one of the biggest things to remember is to not let betrayal turn into bitterness. Doing the deep work to figure out what caused us to get there allows us and leads us into a place of restoration. And I think to be able to do that brings me to my last point. Is we need to remember to trust in God's character and his sovereignty. We need to remember to trust in God's character and his sovereignty. Trust is the exclamation at the end of this Psalms. Remembering who God is, who he says that he is, and that he can and he will continue to provide a way. Psalms 55 verse 23 ends like this. It says, "But as for me, I trust in you." And I think for me, no matter what circumstances you find yourself in, we should allow trust to lead the way. Trust in who God is. Not for us to seek justice on our own, but for allow God to come in with us and to be able to take care of those moments where we feel that bitterness, that woundedness, that brokenness, and betrayal. Will you please join me in prayer? God, thank you for today. Thank you for letting us dive into your word and pushing into some of these hard things. And sometimes your word doesn't package it the way that we want, but it's probably what we need. So allow us today to recognize those places of woundedness, that place of brokenness, that place where we might have felt betrayed. We can recognize those heavy emotions, but more we can recognize who you are, your character, that you're a sovereign God. You're a God who was in the past, who's here today and will be here forever. We can trust in a God who reigns, a just God who loves us and who knows us. So I pray that we can trust in your grace and your mercy to continue to lead the way.